Panel Forum, Racial Justice and Social Equity. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Cannabis Legalization Panel Forum, Racial Justice and Social Equity. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our Cannabis Legalization Panel Forum, Racial Justice and Social Equity. My name is Zoe Patchell, and I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Delaware Cannabis Advocacy Network. We appreciate everyone joining us tonight for this very important conversation. Tonight's presentation was organized as a collaboration of the Delaware Cannabis Policy Coalition, which was established in 2015 in an effort to organize our collective and ongoing efforts to pass adult use cannabis legalization in the first state. The coalition currently includes our organization, Delaware CAN, the Marijuana Policy Project, Delaware NORML, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. Tonight's forum is a part of an ongoing series of virtual forums that we're organizing to highlight particular topics surrounding cannabis legalization to help raise awareness and support the upcoming adult use legalization bill. Tonight's discussion will focus on the disparate racial impact of cannabis prohibition by exploring the inherently racially biased roots of cannabis prohibition laws, how these laws disproportionately are enforced in communities of color, and the lasting effects caused by this harmful policy. We'll also discuss the importance of not just legalizing cannabis, but also the critical importance of creating a fair and equitable cannabis industry and other measures that need to be taken to address the harms caused by cannabis prohibition. The policy of cannabis prohibition is fundamentally rooted in racism, and it's so important that legalization acknowledges and addresses the impact this policy has had over the last 84 years. Prohibition began with slanderous misinformation campaigns that were often aimed at Mexican immigrants and Black Americans and capitalized on racially biased fears, which inevitably led to the first state bans on cannabis in the 1930s, as well as the passing of the Marijuana Tax Act, the nation's first federal ban on cannabis in 1937. 30 plus years later, the Nixon administration successfully sought to misclassify cannabis as a Schedule I controlled substance with dangerous drugs like heroin, where it remains to this day, despite an abundance of hard evidence that shows no factual basis for it to remain a Schedule I. The classification of cannabis as a Schedule I, which came with serious criminal penalties, even for simple possession offenses, was also adopted by state jurisdictions, which has subsequently led to countless individuals being convicted, serving long jail sentences, in some cases life sentences, and suffering the long-term effects and collateral consequences of a criminal conviction. Decades later, the former domestic policy chief of the Nixon administration, John Ehrlichman, admitted that keeping cannabis illegal was politicized as a way to criminalize and discredit political opponents, especially civil rights and anti-war activists and leaders. Today, these policies that were inherently founded and perpetuated by racism are still being enforced in our communities and are still having a devastating and disproportionate impact in communities of color. Data shows that poor and communities of color disproportionately bear the brunt of enforcement of cannabis prohibition laws, despite data showing that all races and socioeconomic demographics buy, sell, and consume cannabis at similar rates. Although the problems extend well beyond cannabis prohibition and are systemic in nature, here in Delaware, African Americans are significantly disproportionately represented in every phase of the criminal justice system for cannabis offenses. Data from the ACLU shows that Black cannabis consumers in Delaware are 4.2 times more likely to be arrested for a cannabis possession-only offense than a white cannabis consumer. While many white consumers are often issued a civil citation under the DCAN statute, Black and minority consumers are more likely to face an arrest for a cannabis possession offense and more likely to be overcharged for personal possession amounts of cannabis that should otherwise be covered under DCRIM. Because of the continued and long-term disproportionate enforcement of cannabis prohibition in communities of color, Delaware now ranks 15th highest in the nation for racial disparities for cannabis possession-only offenses, according to data from a 2020 ACLU report. This harmful policy has had significant effects on the people and the communities that have been disproportionately impacted. In addition to harsh criminal penalties, civil asset forfeiture laws, and difficulty getting out of the criminal justice system once a person's in it, the American Bar Association also identifies over 700 collateral consequences of a criminal conviction. The impact of these collateral consequences extends beyond the person who's been convicted and also greatly impacts their families, their children, future generations, and the communities in which they live. It's so important that when we legalize cannabis, we have this consciously in mind, and that the legislation and future reform efforts address the problems that have been caused by this harmful policy and are crafted in a way that establishes a fair and equitable industry. Following the legalization of cannabis markets in the states that have legalized, an alarming trend began to occur. Despite Blacks and Latinos being overrepresented in the criminal justice system for cannabis offenses, the opposite trend was occurring in the legal cannabis market. The legal cannabis industry in many of the states that have legalized is dominated by mostly white business owners, while those who are sitting in jail for the exact same conduct are predominantly Black. Historically impacted communities and individuals cannot be left behind as we move forward toward legalization of the cannabis market. So we're very grateful tonight to have an amazing lineup of policy experts that have joined us tonight to discuss these topics and delve into these details. Before we introduce our panelists, we have a very special guest speaker tonight, District 2 Wilmington City Council and community organizer Sinead Darby. Sinead Darby, aside from her city council role, is a child behavioral therapist, the founder of Black Mothers in Power, a community activist and leader, and actively serves in the Army National Guard. It's an absolute honor to have Councilwoman Darby here tonight to speak. Thank you so much for joining us. Please welcome Councilwoman Sinead Darby. Oh, you're muted.
I didn't unmute myself. So welcome to 2020 being on virtual. So 2021. But good evening, guys. I was saying thank you for inviting me. Thank you for allowing me to speak and to be a part of this. I am total support of Delaware CAN and the work that you guys are doing and trying to make sure that when we're talking about legalization of marijuana, that we're including this conversation about the inequities that have existed for decades. And if you even want to go further than that, we can. But just making sure that this is a part of the conversation. I do want to say that Delaware has taken some great steps, I think, into moving to this conversation. You know, we have legalized medical marijuana. We started the decriminalization, which is up to 1 ounce. A small possession for recreational use. So I feel like the steps Delaware are taking, we are almost there, right? And then we have HB 110, which was the legalization of recreational use for adults, which only didn't pass by a few votes here, right? So I feel like we're getting really close to having that addressed, and then also revisiting it, right? To make sure that we have the equity provisions included in that to really address the damage of the harsh marijuana laws and the damage that it did to Black and brown communities with the 3 strikes and the war on drugs with Nixon that really impacted, and still you can see the impact on Black and brown communities today. Some of the provisions that I would love to see, and I know that was one of the questions, but I would love to see in this legislation is expungement, right? For people who have marijuana-related offenses from criminal records, preference for license for cultivators, for sellers, processors, and retailers for the Black and brown community who have been impacted by this. What we're seeing is that in other states, once it becomes legalized, that it becomes a market pretty much for white men or just take over the market, when in reality the people who are mostly impacted from it and who's getting left out when it becomes legalized are the Black community and Black men who are being impacted by this the most. So I just want to make sure that we have that Black communities have preference for licensing. They get technical advice and waived application fees. I was looking at what some other states were doing, and these are things that they implemented. So those are the three that really stood out to me. And I also thought the Cannabis Equity Reinvestment Fund was a great idea to really having like a task force to really continue in these conversations and to provide the education to the Black and Brown community about getting into this business, getting into what it means to have legalized marijuana, right? So I think these conversations are important. And I think as a legislator, that on a city level, right? I'm not state, I'm not big, but on a little old Wilmington level, just really thinking about some things that I can do to support the movement. So I am introducing an ordinance to amend Chapter 40 to eliminate pre-employment marijuana testing in the city for city employees. So we're working on that because I feel like it's really important to follow what the state is doing to set the precedent. As Wilmington, we are one of the leading cities in the state of Delaware. So I think it's really important that we are doing this where we can open the pool for candidates for city jobs that are low risk and not dangerous. And I think we got to we have medical marijuana, right? That's legal. How are we making sure we're not discriminating against that community to make sure that they can get jobs within the city? So when I say I'm in full support, I am in full support of legislations like this, addressing the war on drugs, where Black and Brown people were arrested and given heavier sentences 13 times. A Black man is 13 times more likely to be arrested for nonviolent drug crimes than white counterparts, right? 13 times. By 2001, the United States incarcerated more African American men than there was slaves in 1820. When I read these statistics, I was mind blown. I remember the impact of the war on drugs as a child, and remembering of people men who were locked up, Black men who were like my aunt's boyfriends, and they were locked up for a 3-strike rule for drug possession or different things in our community, and just really feeling the impact of being absent from the community, from the Black man and African American men being absent was so vital. But these statistics are so crucial and has to be a part of the provision on a state level. And we just cannot have this conversation without addressing the decades of targeted racism and the impact that it has had on Black and Brown communities. So I am committed to Delaware Can. I am committed to doing what I can do on the city level, advocating on a state level, making sure that the Black men in the community where I come from, they have the education, making sure that they're able to get expungement off their records, able to become the sellers, right? Able to become the cultivators in this new way of being once we get it passed, because I'm confident that it's going to happen really soon here in the state of Delaware for recreational use of cannabis here in the state of Delaware. But I want to say thank you again for having me. I am in full support. Anything that I can do on the state level, on the city level, we're going to try to mirror what the state is doing. We're going to try to push people to think progressive and to think out the box and think about cannabis reform, even on a city level. I think it's important about the opportunities that we're allowing our own residents to have in regards to employment opportunities. So thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. And I don't know if that's any questions or anything, or I think we'll do that later, right?
Yeah, we're going to take questions later. Thank you so much, Councilwoman Darby, for being a part of the conversation tonight and for also helping lead this discussion in our communities and Wilmington City Council. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you want to stay on for questions at the end, we'd love to have you stay on. Okay, so next we're going to turn it over to our panelists. We have an amazing lineup of panelists tonight. First, we have Attorney Devon Ward, the Senior Legislative Counsel for the Marijuana Policy Project. Devon is the lead attorney in MPP's efforts to legalize, regulate, and tax cannabis in Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Prior to his role at MPP, Devon spent nearly a decade gaining experience in law and public policy by serving in legislative roles in the Connecticut State Senate, the Connecticut Department of Public Health, and City of Hartford. Immediately preceding his role with MPP, Devon managed a civil rights-focused law practice in Hartford, Connecticut. Devon is particularly proud of his work on behalf of Connecticut inmates in their battle to be tested and treated for hepatitis C. In 2019, Devon was recognized as one of the new leaders in the law by the Connecticut Law Tribune. Devon is admitted to the bar in all state and federal courts in Connecticut and serves as a board member for several nonprofit organizations in the greater Hartford area. I want to give a special thank you to Devon Ward for joining us tonight and for agreeing to do our panel last minute. Please help me welcome Devon Ward.
Thank you, Zoe, for that great introduction. I appreciate it. So wanted to touch a little bit on, you spoke a little bit about the history of prohibition and how we kind of got to where we are now, where a lot of states are engaging in this fight to legalize and to end prohibition. And so, as you mentioned before, prior to prohibition, being put into place, marijuana prohibition being put into place in 1937, 52% of Americans, or most Americans, had never really heard about marijuana. But today, 52% of Americans have admitted to trying or using it, and 42 million have said they've used it within the past year. And government data has shown that reforming marijuana laws, including legalizing marijuana for adults 21 and older, it hasn't resulted in some of the scare scenarios we hear about often. States that have legalized have lower instances of teen use, have lower instances of folks driving impaired. But wanted to back into 1937 and really talk about, since Prohibition, a number of adults, including, the last 3 presidents, with the exception of President Trump, have admitted or acknowledged using cannabis. And so, if you go back to the 1970s where President Nixon launched the war on drugs, we now know that war was steeped in racial undertones and used as a pretextual reason to target Black Americans and anti-Vietnam War activists. And so you've already mentioned the staggering racial disparities that exist in Delaware. You're more than 4 times as likely to be arrested for cannabis use in Delaware than if you're African American or Black than someone who's white. And so we see that play out nationally, in states that have legalized, like Colorado and Washington, there's been dramatic decreases in those traffic stops that I talked about that are usually disproportionately performed on cars with Black or Latino drivers. And so we know that, unfortunately, we all know since the past, watching the racial justice stuff play out over the past year, that sometimes those interactions can lead to deadly consequences. And we've seen the cannabis use as justification used in a number of criminal cases. It was used in the Trayvon Martin case with saying, he had traces of THC in his system. So, it was used as a reason to justify maybe why, somebody may have wanted to target him. It was used in the Michael Brown situation as well, with, acknowledging his recent use of cannabis. And then, another recent statistic that I found out about is, this past summer, is a quarter of all deadly no-knock drug raids, like the one that was and that Breonna Taylor was involved in Kentucky, involved cannabis during a 7-year period from 2010 to 2017, according to the Washington Post. And so, legalization is really one of the main tools that we have to ending the racial disparities, and using marijuana and cannabis as a justification to target Black and brown communities. And so it's really important. I look at it, my approach and my introduction to the cannabis industry was through the lens of being a criminal defense attorney. And, the legalization would really help in efforts, to end some of those racial disparities and justification using cannabis to cause real harm to Black and brown communities. And so that's why, I applaud, Delaware for really considering and taking this next step, and considering legalization, and really think it's an important conversation that's taking place tonight. And so I thank you guys for having me. I think you touched on a lot of the points, from a historical context, but I think, that legalization, it just offers so many benefits and it has so many, the prohibition just steeped in so many racial undertones that legalization, not just decriminalization, legalization is the only way we really get to achieve some equity. And so I really thank you guys for having me. And I'm going to stick around for the rest of the conversation. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Attorney Devon Ward. We are really appreciative of you being here with us tonight and sharing your expertise with our audience. And thank you again for volunteering last minute to be one of our panelists tonight. Thank you so much.
No problem.
So next we have Olivia Naugle, who is the legislative analyst for the Marijuana Policy Project and co-organizer of Delaware Cannabis Policy Coalition. Olivia leads MPP's lobbying efforts to legalize marijuana in Maryland. She also monitors legislation and advocates for marijuana policy reform in the District of Columbia, Delaware, Florida, Indiana, Kansas, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Olivia is passionate about criminal justice reform and holds a Master of Arts in Criminology. Olivia has also dedicated quite a bit of time to traveling to Delaware over the years and has been instrumental in helping us with our reform efforts in the first state as a go-to source of knowledge, guidance, and inspiration. Please welcome Olivia Naugle.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with my fellow panelists. And thank you, Zoe, for all the work you've done and continue to do to reform Delaware's cannabis laws. It really has been awesome working with you, and I look forward to continuing that work and hopefully ending prohibition in Delaware. So the intersection of cannabis legalization with racial justice and with criminal justice is certainly what brought me to this issue and what continues to fuel my passion and my work at MPP. So in my remarks here, I really wanted to touch on social equity in legalization. Social equity is something, definitely something we hear a lot of in this space, but I really wanted to break down what it is we're talking about when we're talking about social equity in cannabis legalization, as well as some of the approaches that we've seen taken at this point. So what is social equity? Social equity as it pertains to the cannabis industry and cannabis legalization, it's about righting past wrongs. It's about ensuring that individuals and communities who have been disproportionately harmed by cannabis prohibition have both the opportunity and the means to participate in and to benefit from the legal cannabis industry. And that's essential for the reasons we just heard laid out by Devon and others before, that our cannabis laws have disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities. They have not been equally enforced. That's true in every state. That's true in Delaware. And cannabis prohibition has devastated these communities, whether it be traumatic police stops or searches, deadly police stops and searches, an arrest and criminal record for simple cannabis possession, which we know can affect one's opportunities in housing, employment, and et cetera. The list goes on. If an individual is jailed for a cannabis offense and the impact that has not only on them, but their family and friends. So this is the disproportionate impact that prohibition has had on communities of color. So when you decide to legalize cannabis and create legitimate opportunities for its production and sale and generate millions of dollars, when that's something folks have been engaged in for years and criminalized for, it's an injustice to ignore that history and reality. And that's why social equity in cannabis legalization is so important, so that those who have, borne the brunt of this war on cannabis have an opportunity to, rebuild their futures and benefit from this newly legal industry. So how is social equity achieved? What do these provisions look like, say, in a legalization bill? I would say, and us at MPP say this as well, there are three main pillars of social equity when we're talking about legalization. The first one would be expungement. This is key and step one in beginning to repair past harms. Expungement provisions should be included in legislation to legalize cannabis so that those with past convictions can move on with their lives without carrying around a scarlet letter that a conviction carries. So it's as if that conviction never happened, right? There's no good reason to continue to punish someone for past offenses once that conduct is now deemed legal. So the ideal option is for states to include automatic expungement. Automatic expungement allows the process kind of to be streamlined by the state. An individual wouldn't have to file a petition or pay any related fees to have their record expunged. The idea is to make it, as least burdensome as possible on that individual. But ultimately, it'll be up to, states to determine what form of expungement is possible. The Illinois adult use legalization law was probably the most impressive model thus far as it pertains to expunging past cannabis convictions. In all, there's around 770,000 cannabis-related records that'll be eligible for expungement, and I know they've already went through a number of those, so that's a big deal for sure. The second pillar of social equity that I wanted to touch on is diversity and inclusion in the cannabis industry. So making sure that those who have been disproportionately impacted have the opportunity and the means to obtain licenses and to participate in the industry. So typically that would mean, creating a social equity program. That's what we've seen done in Illinois and Massachusetts. So defining who is eligible to be a social equity applicant. Again, this will be up to the state to define, but, one option would be, those with a prior cannabis conviction, those with a parent with a prior conviction, or those who have lived for a certain amount of time, in an area with disproportionate cannabis enforcement. And then once a social equity applicant is defined, the idea is that they could be eligible to receive assistance in a number of ways. And just to name a few ideas, we have a sheet of MPP that we have a whole menu of options here, but just to name some big ones, maybe social equity applicants get a head start in the licensing process. Maybe they get additional points if there's a scored licensing process. Having certain licensing categories be exclusive to social equity applicants, which is what Massachusetts did with their delivery licenses. Also allowing social equity applicants to have lower fees when applying, providing technical assistance in the application process, because we know that process can be very long and complicated. And also providing access to grants or loans for startup costs. We know that, minority communities in particular, access to capital is a big issue. And the idea of all of these is just to lower the barriers of entry so that it's not just, large corporations with deep pockets that are able to gobble up all of these licenses. And then finally, the third pillar of social equity that I wanted to hit on is community reinvestment. So this is a billion-dollar industry. Washington State just brought in over $400 million last year in tax revenue for legal cannabis. Colorado brought in over $300 million last year. And a big piece of social equity in legalization is reinvesting a significant portion of that tax revenue in communities that have been most impacted by prohibition. This is important to begin to right past wrongs, but also because not everyone who has been impacted by prohibition per se wants to be involved in the legal industry. In fact, there's probably a lot that don't. So this is a way to make sure that those folks are still able to benefit from the legal industry. And I think, this is an opportunity for states to listen to those community needs and really come up with some creative and substantive ways to reinvest into these communities. I'm working closely with Delegate Jazz Lewis in Maryland on his bill and that effort there. And in his bill, they've actually allocated 20% of the tax revenue would go to funding Maryland's four historically Black colleges and universities, which have been severely underfunded. And I think that's, really unique and cool. Delegate Lewis and other lawmakers who crafted the bill really thought about community needs and how they could accomplish meeting those needs through his legalization bill. And then some other possibilities for this type of community reinvestment, could include housing assistance, could include reentry services such as job training, maybe small business loans for residents of those communities. But again, I think it is up to individual states to listen to community needs when thinking about this piece. So those are the big points that I wanted to touch on. I feel like I've been talking for a long time now, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And I certainly look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you all so much. think you're on mute, Zoe.
I knew I was going to do that at least once. Thank you again, Olivia. Thank you so much for all the work that you do here in Delaware and all the work that you do nationwide to help end cannabis prohibition. We're so grateful for all the efforts that you do here in Delaware and, continually traveling to Delaware to help us legalize cannabis in the first state. Thank you again, Olivia. So our final panelist tonight is Kareem Kenyatta, co-founder of Majority Minority Group and consultant with Zach Stamp Consulting. Mr. Kenyatta joined Zach Stamp Consulting in 2014. His practice focuses on government relations. Mr. Kenyatta has over a decade of experience working with Illinois legislature. Before joining the company, he served as Director of Legislative Affairs for Illinois Attorney General Lisa Madigan. As legislative director, he implemented and coordinated a comprehensive legislative strategy for the Attorney General during each legislative session. Prior to his role with the Illinois Attorney General, Mr. Kenyatta worked with the Speaker of the Illinois House of Representatives Research and Budget Office, where he represented the Speaker and House members in negotiations on legislation, budget appropriations, and public policy initiatives. In his capacity, he also managed the appropriation process for a number of state agencies and regional authorities. Mr. Kenyatta also assisted in negotiating Illinois' cannabis legalization legislation, held as the most social equity-driven cannabis law in the country. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Kareem Kenyatta. Please help me welcome Mr. Kenyatta.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Appreciate it. And as Zoe mentioned, all of the legislative experience that I was able to gather throughout the years was great to prepare for everything that we had to deal with passing a cannabis bill in Illinois. We were in a unique situation in Illinois because we were one of the first states that actually passed cannabis legalization through the legislature versus a ballot, such as other states have done to actually get legalization through the process. And one of the advantages of that was we were able to collaborate with a number of different lawmakers, especially in the Black and Latino caucus. And when I say we, I should clarify that I was actually representing the Marijuana Policy Project at the time, and had the privilege of working directly with leaders of the Black and Latino caucus in terms of just what they wanted to see go into a cannabis legalization bill. Illinois, prior to legalization, we had the benefit of seeing obviously what other states had done. And we also had our own medical program that, at the time was not diverse at all. It was 99.9% white. And, obviously they brought in a lot of revenue, but the diversity just wasn't there. And so as we started the discussion about recreational use, that was one of the first places where we started is how can we, as Olivia mentioned, implement, the three pillars of diversity and inclusion and expungement and community restoration into a bill that we could get the state's attorney's office and the state police to sign off on. And, we spent the majority of the time, we started the discussions in early 2019 and, it took all the way up until a couple of days before session adjourned in May 31st before we had an agreement with all the parties involved. And so the process leading up to that, again, a lot of negotiations with law enforcement, but also negotiations with community advocacy groups to see what did they want to see in the bill that could provide restoration to communities that the war on drugs actually implemented. So when you look at the three pillars, and I'll be brief here because I know we have a lot of questions to get through, but for expungement, we took a certain amount, I believe it was 30 milligrams. And, if you were arrested for that amount, it was a somewhat automatic expungement process that the governor was able to just kind of initiate an expungement. If it was over that amount, you have to work with the state's attorneys in order to do that. But, we were fortunate to have a few state's attorneys such as Kim Fox in Cook County that was willing to take this head on and try to initiate as much of an automatic process as possible. So, I think that was one of despite all the other issues that we may have had with the bill, that was a really key achievement to work in, is the expungement piece. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, we actually built into the application process a way, if you were a social equity applicant, and for us, a social equity applicant meant if you had a cannabis arrest, or if you had a parent or a child that had a cannabis arrest, or you lived in a disproportionately impacted area, you were allowed to get 50 extra points in the application process, which is significant considering that a lot of these applications are determined by 1 point or more. So, by doing that, we felt like we were giving social equity applicants the opportunity, and in order for you to be considered social equity, you had to be at least 51% owner of a company. And so that was to address not having just major corporations come in and just take over the industry, such as, what we saw on the medical side, basically. And for the third pillar, when it comes to reinvesting in the community, we established a program, the Renew, Reinvest, and Restore program, which actually takes the profits, 25% of the sales from cannabis, to give back to the community. And just recently, I think recipients were awarded over $35 million in grant funds from this program. We call it the R3 program. So that was significant in the sense, and with this program, it's not just your typical grant program. The program was designed for communities to specifically put together programs that are unique to their specific needs. And for some communities that might be financial literacy programs. For others, it may be violence prevention. But through this program, you're able to actually obtain funding from the state to qualify for whatever unique needs your community has. And so from our perspective, that enabled, folks and organizations that weren't able to get typical funding from the state. It enabled them to apply for these programs. And, so far from what we've seen, the funding is actually going from the state to these organizations. So that's something else that we're really happy about. I would say in terms of lessons learned, when it comes to the legislative process, again, a lot of negotiation, a lot of involvement from a lot of different parties on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrats. But, one thing that we may have overlooked is the actual implementation of the bill. And I'll tell you why that's important, because although you may lay out all the details in the legislation that you can, if you don't, address everything in implementation, you kind of face a problem like we have now in Illinois, where our program has been delayed over 6 months now because, the governor's office, and to no fault of their own, but they chose a firm that graded applications, and the process that firm used, there's been a lot of disagreement about. And so as a result of that, the process has been delayed. There have been a number of lawsuits. And so now we're awaiting the outcome of those lawsuits. And, basically it looks like we're going to have to amend or develop a trailer bill to address some of these concerns. And so hopefully we can get that done within the next 2 or 3 months, because, the current market on the recreational side, Illinois made over $1 billion in recreational use last year alone. And so the market is definitely there, but unfortunately the diversity still is not there. It still benefits the current industry, which is still the guys who were on the medical side, and they're still benefiting from recreational use right now. So that's something that we obviously would like to change. Overall, I still have a lot of faith in the program that we created. I still think it could be a model for other states to follow, but there are obviously things that we could have done better, and I think we're learning that on the implementation side. But I'll stop there, Zoe, in case there are any other questions. But happy to stick around and answer, and do whatever I can to assist as we continue this discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mr. Kareem Kenyatta, for joining us tonight, and thank you so much for sharing your experience and expertise with us. Thank you again to all our incredible speakers. This was such a really informative presentation, and we thank each one of you for being a part of our panel. Before we get to the questions from the public, we have invited elected officials to join the conversation tonight to ask questions or give comment. We're thankful. I think, do we have? Yes. All right. So we have Prime sponsor, House District 24 Representative Ed Ozinski on with us tonight. Representative Ed Ozinski is the prime House sponsor of the cannabis legalization legislation and has sponsored nearly every piece of cannabis legislation that's been introduced in the General Assembly. Thank you so much, Representative Ozinski, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Zoe. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Great. Thank you, Zoe. And I want to thank Councilwoman Darby for joining us and her support for adult recreational marijuana. And of course, Olivia from MPP, she's worked with us and helped us. And if I may, I'd just like to tell you we're working on the new draft, which we hope to have finalized in the next week or so. And one thing, this legislation and this initiative actually started by two city legislators, Senator Margaret Rose Henry and Representative Helene Keeley back in 2017. Unfortunately, before they retired, they could not secure enough votes to get that legislation passed. And I did step up to continue the fight back in 2019. 2019, we fell short again. And then, of course, 2020 with the pandemic. So, but we're feeling pretty confident this year. But we have listened to advocates. We have learned a lot. This is ever evolving. And we realized that what we were hearing about big marijuana being an issue for local entrepreneurs and people in hard impacted areas to getting into the industry was an issue. So we wanted to address that. And we've taken elements from social equity programs in California, Illinois, Michigan, Massachusetts. They were all reviewed, as well as criteria and eligibility recommendations from the Minority Cannabis Business Association. And of course, Zoe's group, Delaware Cannabis Advocacy Network. We listened to them, and what we've put together is a social equity applicant. And the criteria for the social equity applicant mirrors that of Illinois, which is considered one of the more progressive social equity programs in the country. Eligibility requirements from Michigan and Massachusetts have also been blended into to better fit a policy for Delaware. So things such as being a Delaware resident, to be eligible for social equity, you could have a conviction of any marijuana related offense, or being married to or a child of a person who was convicted. So we have those things in there. We have discount fees in our social equity program. We have technical assistance for applicants. We're developing low interest loans, grants, and of course the technical assistance. And we do have the expungement language. Expungement for all prior cannabis offenses for conduct which is legalized under this new legislation. So we have been addressing this, and what we're also happy about is we're adding social equity licenses. So we have 4 categories of licenses: retail, testing, cultivation, and product manufacturing. So we're taking half of the retail licenses are going to be set aside for social equity, and a third of the cultivation licenses will be set aside for social equity applicants. And a third of the product manufacturing licenses will be set aside for social equity. And we're also creating, like Jersey, the micro business licenses, which are smaller, a smaller business footprint for a license. So yeah, I'm happy to say that we are addressing everything that our previous speakers were discussing, and I'm hoping we can get this thing finalized and we can get the needed 3/5 majority in the Delaware legislature to get this passed and on the governor's desk. So thank you, and I'll stick around for any questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Oops, I didn't know if I was muted again. Thank you so much, Representative, for your dedication to common sense cannabis policy in the first state. We appreciate you joining us tonight and being part of this very important conversation. So I do believe that I saw, yep. So we also have Delaware State Auditor Kathy McGinnis, who recently released an independent special report on cannabis legalization. Please welcome State Auditor Kathy McGinnis.
Hi there. Thank you, Zoe, and everyone listening. I'm your state auditor, and it's my job to look after your tax dollars. And to that end, I examine current spending and potential revenue generators. So I ran the numbers. That's what I've done, and I've given legislators some more information and hopefully being a good partner in good government practices. So I believe that what's possible fiscally with regulating and taxing legal marijuana, we could have a $43 million annual boost, which awaits Delaware. Our neighboring states, as we know, what New Jersey has just done recently, I think 2 days ago, I decided to analyze the potential financial impact for Delaware, and that is what Zoe just spoke to with the recent release of the special report. Not only is it $43 million in potential revenue with our formula, but the market size we believe is about 215 million, 1,400 to 2,400 jobs over the next 5 years. And this is with a certain tax rate, which is just the one that we used. And that is really not something to focus on. But this revenue doesn't take into account the estimate for, savings Delaware could realize from decreased court costs, among other economic benefits, or doesn't even begin to touch on the social equity and criminal justice reform benefits that full legalization that we believe for adults would provide. So I have the report. You can go to auditor.delaware.gov. We took a fiscal approach to this, and I know there's so much more. And we're talking about prohibition. And the fact is, decades of prohibition have done little to prevent the sale of recreational use of marijuana in Delaware. And what prohibition has done instead is allow an illicit market to thrive. So we also, touched in a little bit in some comments that we thought to reform our criminal justice system in an honest way requires that we stop criminalizing marijuana. And we do recognize communities of color have been hurt the most by prohibition, and revenues generated by regulation could be reinvested to help repair years of damage from some policies. So with that being said, when we're looking at our neighboring states and what's being invested, we believe the first state cannot and should not be last to approve legislation in this region. And legalization just provides an opportunity for revenue, social and racial justice, and jobs. So I believe that full legalization for adult use is in that next logical discussion to have. And hopefully I've done my part to help that discussion along. I'm going to stay on if there's any questions.
Thank you again, Delaware State Auditor Kathy McGinnis, for joining us tonight and being a part of this conversation, as well as putting out your fiscal perspective in your special report. We appreciate you adding your input to this conversation. So Delaware State Auditor Kathy McGinnis will also be a part of our next legalization forum Thursday, March 18th, which will focus on the fiscal cost of cannabis prohibition and the economic benefits on Thursday, March 18th. Thank you again, Delaware State Auditor Kathy McGinnis. Do we have any other legislators that are on with us? It does not look like it. Okay, so now we're going to move into public questions. We've asked public participants to pre-submit questions for our panelists, and we've already received several. If you've not pre-submitted a question, you can also do that by dropping a question in the Facebook Live comment section, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can tonight. So for our first question that's been pre-submitted, can any of our panelists explain how cannabis policy reform works in other areas of criminal justice reform, such as policing reform, mass incarceration, racial profiling, and other policing issues?
Well, I could kick off. I think one of the main one of the main things you see is, with law enforcement, one of the big fights that we had in Illinois is, cannabis, as I think Devon mentioned before, is often used as a reason for police to interact with Black or brown folks. And so what you see is they may be pulled over for cannabis. Maybe an officer smells cannabis, but then it turns out maybe there's a warrant for traffic tickets or something else. And what turns out to be or starts as a small issue usually ends up being a bigger issue that could lead to incarceration or something else. And so, I think if you can reform even the way police interact with folks when it comes to cannabis, it just, it helps in terms of just, with opening the community up to even interaction with law enforcement, because it removes the fear that just because you may have cannabis in your possession doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to jail or prison for a certain amount of time. But I'm sure others may have thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think the one thing when I started to get in this work was, like I said, I came at it as an attorney who had practiced, criminal defense law. But, as Kareem said, using that justification that I smell cannabis based on laws that are already on the books in a lot of states, that allows a police officer to search your person, to search your car, sometimes even potentially search your house. And so, once they're into your person or into your vehicle, it's a loss of your liberty. And then there's a lot more that can come downhill kind of from that. But the other thing, when you're talking about criminal justice and you're talking about cannabis reform is, a lot of states also have these civil forfeiture laws that allow police to seize money and property of suspected marijuana offenders. At times you may not even have to be convicted. You just have to be charged. And the money that you had and the property that you had, sometimes, I've ran into in Connecticut a number of instances where somebody was, stopped. There was a suspicion that they had cannabis in the car, and an officer may have found a small amount of cannabis for personal use. And that allowed the car to be seized, and whatever money they had, if the money was in close proximity to the small amount of cannabis, all the money that they had to be seized, And so to me, those links to the criminalization of cannabis have just had devastating effects for particularly Black and brown communities. And then when you just go into thinking about the convictions, what a felony or a drug conviction can do to someone's life. You may not be able to apply for student loans. You may not be able to apply for housing. It may affect your custody. When you start talking about all the collateral consequences that come with a drug conviction, it's no wonder why the criminalization of this product has had such devastating effects on communities that have been over-policed. And then, the other thing that, once I started getting into policy work too, is when you start looking at the data, just the over-policing. I'm based in Connecticut, and I often say, if police decided to patrol, the University of Connecticut with the same urgency that they patrolled, some urban communities, they'd likely find, just as much, if not more, illegal products up there. But the unfortunate part is they patrol these communities looking for reasons to arrest people, and that's what police do. And I'm not here to disparage police. That's their job. Is to enforce the laws on the books, but that's why it's incumbent on us to try to change these laws, so police can start, using their resources for violent crimes, for crimes that have actual victims, versus perpetuating this law that's steeped in these racial undertones. So.
Yeah, if I could just chime in really quickly, I think Kareem and Devon laid that out perfectly. I think we're really in a time in our country right now. Having this reckoning with police reform, and any meaningful police reform, it has to include ending cannabis prohibition as well. I think Devon touched on this in his opening remarks, but when we talk about using cannabis as a pretext, which is probably the number one pretext used to stop and search folks in this country. But in Colorado and Washington, there have been dramatic decreases in traffic searches. The first two states to legalize cannabis, and we know that they are disproportionately performed on cars with Black or Latino drivers. We're still in this country arresting over 600,000 folks for cannabis, 90% for possession alone. And we know that legalization is going to dramatically reduce those arrests and those policing interactions. So I think it's key, and it's step one, right? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for weighing in on that. So the next question we kind of touched on a little bit, especially just now, Devon, you kind of mentioned some of this in your last response, but if we could go into a little more detail and explain how systemic racism and the effects of cannabis prohibition affect other systems or outcomes in society, such as education, housing, healthcare, and other needs.
Yeah, as I just mentioned, if you have a conviction on your record, once you're thrown into the criminal justice system that way, you lose a lot of your rights. If it's a felony conviction, you may lose your right to vote in some states. And in Connecticut, that right's restorable, but in some states it's not. You may lose, certain custody advantages. You may not be allowed to apply for certain jobs. You may lose housing opportunities. And usually housing, I look at housing from a policy standpoint as a hub, right? Where you live, it affects your education, it affects your transportation, it affects your health outcomes. And so if you're predisposed, or you're basically put into a certain area and you can't have housing opportunities, you're not allowed to leave certain neighborhoods, essentially because you have the scarlet letter on you. It affects a lot of different outcomes in your life. And so, I think the fact that this product is continuing to be criminalized and forcing people into the criminal justice system, it impacts every single thing in their world. And so, that's why we have to really, legalization, not just decriminalization, legalization, making this product legal, regulated, and taxed is really the only way that we can eliminate some of those collateral and adverse consequences that affect everything from health to housing to upward mobility and social mobility. So.
Yeah, no, I think Devon summed that up perfectly. Yeah, and I guess another piece of it with legalization, I think this is still being figured out across the country, but just the pressure, the social pressure people feel about cannabis, and they're afraid to either take an edible or smoke because their employer may test them and they might lose their job. And so although that standard doesn't exist for alcohol, and I still think we're getting there on cannabis, I think legalization at least pushes us further in that direction as well.
Thank you so much. So we have several pre-submitted questions. This next question comes from Russell from Newcastle County. How will cannabis legalization laws be used to empower and encourage minority ownership of small businesses? And I think we kind of touched on it, but if anybody wants to discuss that.
Well, I could just touch on briefly, following the legalization in Illinois, my business partner and I established the Majority Minority Group. And the purpose of that was to help people navigate themselves through the application process. And, a big reason why we wanted to do that is because, you find, especially in, Black and brown and folks that are interested in getting into the industry, there's just a lack of resources. And, when it comes to even having someone to look over your business plan or having a corporate attorney to figure out what the structure should be before you apply, all that stuff is important. And being a small business owner by itself is challenging. But when you talk about being a small business owner in the cannabis space, it's even more challenging because of, all the state regulations and the fact that it's still illegal federally. So, I think if you are even thinking about going into this industry, everything that you have to do to prepare yourself to get into that sets you up for whatever else you want to do, because there's just so much you have to, so many T's that have to be crossed and I's that have to be dotted.
I just, when I talk about the economic benefits of cannabis legalization here in the United States, I think it's important to have a 50,000 foot view. And the reality is, Cannabis has been legal in Canada for quite some time. Mexico's soon to legalize. We're discussing ending federal prohibition on the federal level here in the United States. A lot of folks who are engaged in this work, believe that the federal prohibition is likely to be lifted, sometime in the next, 2 to 5 years. And so when you think about the industry from that 50,000 foot view, you're talking about a national industry, you're talking about an international industry, and there's so many opportunities to be engaged. A lot of folks like to concentrate on the business opportunities in terms of being an entrepreneur in this business, but there's also a ton of job opportunities, thousands of job opportunities, and cannabis jobs on average pay more than regular jobs. We're talking about $50,000, $60,000 jobs in some instances, where those to me are where communities of color can really start to build, generational wealth. If you have a mom and a dad who are going to work every day and working, and making a decent living, 9 times out of 10, that kid that's growing up in that household is going to have a lot more opportunity than somebody's parents who are working a minimum wage job. And so, to me, I like to look at this industry. I try not to compare it to alcohol, but if you look at the alcohol industry, that's a national and international industry. And if you know how to ferment wine in Oregon, there's no stopping you from going to get a job over in the Cognac region of France either, right? So once you get those skills, the point I'm trying to make is once you get those skills, whether it's in cultivating, whether it's in marketing or advertising the product, whether it's in retail, whether it's in transporting this product in a secure and safe manner, those skills are transferable, within this industry and into others. And so, this is really an exciting time in the cannabis industry, in that, it is almost, it's like the roaring 20s almost all over again with the end of alcohol prohibition. It's really an opportunity, significantly for communities of color to get in on the ground floor and really create, some of that generational wealth that's somebody alluded to. And that's on the employee side. On the entrepreneurship side, there's a tremendous opportunity to be able to create market share and be able to to be a player, at least on the state level and potentially on the national level, if you have the dollars to in this industry. So it's a really exciting time. There are tremendous opportunities, direct opportunities in terms of business, and then, as Kareem mentioned, ancillary opportunities for folks like lawyers and accountants and builders, even building cultivation facilities or retail facilities. There's just so many opportunities available in this industry. There's really something there for everyone, and it's really a exciting time and an opportunity to really right some of the wrongs in terms of trying to help communities of color and also help them build some of that generational wealth. So.
Thank you so much. So this next question comes from Jamie from Newcastle County, and I see that community organizer Chandra Pitts of One Village Alliance also kind of touches on this. So how can we guarantee that gold standard equity, justice, expungement, inclusivity, diversity, and the neediest community reinvestment components are all part of the framework that is not just signed into law, but is actually implemented in the regulatory body?
Liv?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll defer to you a little.
Oh, I was gonna let you go ahead and start, Kareem. I think that one would be best for you.
Well, I think first step is you have to make sure that you do pass a strong law, strong legislation. And as I mentioned before, I think in Illinois, a big part of our process was just sitting around the table with everyone that's going to be impacted, from community advocacy groups to folks that have been arrested for cannabis, to entrepreneurs, to state police, state's attorney. Get everyone at the table, and make sure also the governor's office or whoever's going to be in charge of implementing the bill is also at the table, and make sure you can hold them accountable for what happens after the legislation passes. I think that's really the key. There's a lot that people wanted to see go into the Illinois bill, a lot more, even though Illinois is kind of seen as one of the more progressive states when it comes to a lot that we put in it. But believe me, there were a lot of people that wanted us to go further. And, I think the one thing that I would always advise is, it's a long-term process, and you're not going to get everything right in even the first attempt to pass the bill. And, as a lobbyist, you represent a lot of different industries. And one thing that I can tell you is consistent, whether it's alcohol or any other industry, is that there's legislation every year to impact and to change that particular industry. And cannabis is no different. So, but the first step is obviously passing the initial law and just building upon that to, as you see things, whether it be in the community, whether it's, your corporate attorney or, as Devon mentioned, some of the more ancillary folks that are involved in the industry, change and suggestions are going to come from everywhere. But, again, passing the law is the first step.
Zoe, may I chime in?
Yes, please.
Yeah, and I think with here in Delaware, we need 3/5 of a majority to pass a legislation. So even though we've sat down and we've heard some great suggestions and we're trying to address all concerns and make a perfect bill, but the reality is I need to get the 3/5 votes to pass it. So it's not going to be perfect the first time. We kind of need to take baby steps on that. So there are things that I completely agree with, but I know if I do that, then I may lose votes on, from these legislators. And if I do what these legislators want, I may lose votes from these other legislators. So I like to use the analogy of making sausage. Everybody wants sausage, but not everybody can agree on what recipe to use. So we have to come up with something where I know I can get that majority of votes. And then, like, I've talked to a colleague from Colorado, and he says, ever since we've passed that legislation 10 years ago, there's always several bills every year on the agenda that make tweaks and adjustments. So I just ask everybody to, realize that it may not seem perfect to everybody, but we need to take these baby steps and it will evolve into something better. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Ozinski.
May I jump in as well?
Please, definitely.
Okay, so in my report, I advocate for lawmakers to develop a responsible framework for legalization, and with what Representative Ozinski just said, he has to do what he has to do to get this to a, over the goalposts here. So it is a balance. It's a balance in legislation and public perception and science as well. But to your question, or the questions out there in the audience about how are we going to make sure that certain marks are hit within that legislation, there's always the opportunity to earmark funds or set funds aside for accountability and transparency from your independent auditor's office, where we can have some sort of independent reporter look at different mechanisms within the process and the program along the years. But I think there's going to be ample discussion here with lawmakers for this policy, but I'm confident that Delaware lawmakers, like those in other states, have the ability to get it right.
Thank you so much. Representative Ozinski, we also have another question that would probably be best suited if you would answer. Will the bill presented to the House offer automatic expungements for those who have past misdemeanor cannabis convictions? I know you kind of touched on it, but if you could expand on that for us, please.
We are addressing expungement. Again, this is one of them issues where we're not getting a lot of, positive feedback on automatic, and that would be due to the fiscal note of automatic expungement. As I think some of the previous speakers spoke, one of the states had over 700,000 or something. It was a huge number, and that's a concern because I think once the fiscal note alone on this bill without automatic is getting bigger and bigger as we get closer and closer to a vote on this. So we are looking at that. I would love to have that in there. The question is if we can get enough support due to the fiscal note of the automatic expungement, but we are putting in the complete expungement for all past offenses. but we haven't gone quite as far yet as for automatic. And that is still in the discussion right now. So thanks.
Representative Linsky, I know some of the conversations that we've had on that, part of that is that we just don't even have a mechanism in Delaware that allows for automatic expungements, correct? Like there's nothing that would allow for that process without adding a considerable amount of extra legislation.
Yeah, we have several expungement bills that have already passed. Senator Brown passed an expungement bill last session. So we're going to be doing the expungements, but Delaware is not set up yet for the automatic. And like I said, there would be possibly a separate piece of legislation that could be addressed, and then that would implement that for all these offenses. So it's definitely something we're trying to work in.
And then, of course, there's also, the projected Clean Slate Act that advocates are working on as well that would help overcome those gaps and whatnot. So thank you so much for sharing that. So we also have a question. We kind of touched on this, but I definitely wanted to get to Torianne Parker, community organizer. What impact do you believe cannabis legalization will have on creating generational wealth for Black and Brown families? What role should Delaware State University play in encouraging students to get in on the ground floor of the green boom?
Yeah, so I think I spoke a little bit to the first half of that question. But, as I'm working on the legislation here in Connecticut, I think the role that universities like Delaware State can play, and Kareem alluded to it, is that, some of these equity businesses are going to need technical assistance. They're going to need folks to help them with the accounting, with setting up their business, their corporate structure. They're going to need help with their contracts, with navigating zoning, permitting. I hate to compare cannabis to alcohol, but it's almost like getting permitted for a liquor store, where it has to go through local zoning, advertising, permitting. You're going to need contractors, contracts not only with the vendors, but you may have to be looking at employment contracts and labor peace agreements. So all of those things in terms of helping businesses get off the ground and really serving as an incubator, and almost a incubator and facilitator. I think a local university like Delaware State could play a big role in helping businesses get off the ground with some of their expertise. I'll open it up to someone else.
I also see it as a talent retainer. So many times when kids go to colleges, they end up staying in that area, getting a job, getting an internship. And Delaware needs to be a talent retainer. And this is an opportunity because keep in mind, Del State has a great agriculture program as well. So I see it as, maybe there's different majors now that we can maybe pivot and be a little more nimble with what we're offering with the market around us and the market in the state. But it also could be something where folks could get a degree in an area that speaks directly to this market and the auxiliary jobs that come with it.
Yep, and in Illinois, I would just add that we actually created incentives for community colleges and other programs to work with the current industry and folks interested in getting into the industry to, as I mentioned, give them those technical skills that they need, which, I think education and everything, that's a big part of when you talk about creating generational wealth. It's one thing to just get a license, but if you don't have the skills and the knowledge to know what to do once you get that license, you're not going to be able to really capture that wealth. So education is as important as actually getting into the industry itself. So I definitely think there's a role for universities to play going forward.
Absolutely. So, I just wanted to make sure that we got to Chandra Pitts' question as well, to speak to the inequity in the dispensary application cost and process, criminal backgrounds of people working in the industry, and automatic expungement of marijuana convictions. We've just talked about the expungement part, but is there anything that any of our panelists would want to add on to any of that?
Sure. I think I touched on this a little bit in my opening remarks, but when it comes to the inequity in the application process, the biggest thing is making sure that there's low barriers to entry. That application process can be overwhelming and cumbersome to folks who don't have someone on their team who can go through that for them. The fees, if you don't have the capital to pay an excessive fee, you're not going to get in. So I think really making sure that there's ample opportunity to enter the industry, but also that we're making sure that those barriers to entry are low, so that it's not just folks with deep pockets and connections that can get through the process and get licensed.
I think that what we've seen in the industry, and I'm so glad it's changing. I'm really excited for Representative Osinski and Senator Hardy's legislation, because they're hitting on a lot of these issues. It's always been Wall Street versus Main Street. It's always the big guy. It's always the big, larger companies, and then the small guy can't compete. Whether it's with affordability, having the know-how with the contracts or the negotiation, or who et cetera. So it sounds like a lot of these things are being addressed within the legislation. As far as barriers to jobs, there's opportunity out there, and maybe not just in this industry, but holistically for the state, are opportunities where, maybe you do you don't do a background check for, the first 8 weeks. You have someone come on and do a job and a certain type of program. And then if this person works out, you can decide if you are really going to use that as a barrier or not, because there are certain industries, I know in certain counties right now, where they do have second chances, where they have, ex-felons coming in and teaching a skill, or maybe they're coming out with a little bit of a skill that has to be enhanced, and they can go into that industry. So this should be no different. This should be allowed across the board as well with the cannabis industry, where there's all types of jobs. You've mentioned it, from marketing to cultivation to what have you, to being part ownership, to being in retail. So there's so many aspects of it. So if there are some that have something on their record, because we do know that people make bad decisions on occasion. It's not people are bad. We're human. So second chances could be some type of program that works very well with this industry, I would think.
Yeah, and I would just add, in Illinois, we cut the cost in half for social equity applicants. So, if the license fee was $10,000 for everyone else, we cut it to $5,000 for social equity applicants. So that's one way to address it. And I would say, just from experience, and I don't want to add to the fiscal cost of the representative's bill in Delaware, but one thing to consider is giving, we created a fund for people post-license that they can gain access. But, if there are funds available to people as they go through the application process, if they fit a certain criteria, that may be something to consider too. Because I know a lot of the folks we worked with, although they had access to capital, it's not like they came from, wealthy families where they just had millions laying around so they could apply for this. So that's something else to think about, just based off our experience here in Illinois.
So the last question that I have, and I'm not sure if I see any other questions or comments, but do past enforcement inequities adversely impact market participation by fostering distrust in impacted communities?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
The question is, do past enforcement inequities adversely impact market participation by fostering distrust in impacted communities?
I mean, I haven't seen that, typically, because when usually they write this legislation, they put in wording that prevents discrimination from folks who work in the industry. It prevents, prosecution for engaging in legal conduct or being employed at one of these cannabis establishments. So, usually when a state goes down the legalization route, the belief is that a lot of that discrimination, a lot of that targeting goes away. And that's that's looks like it's been the case based off the data we've seen so far in states like Colorado and Washington. So usually, there's language in the bill that prohibits folks from specifically discriminating against folks who are employed in this industry. So the hope is that some of those enforcement or discrimination tactics are lifted once legalization happens. Kareem, what's been your experience? I would probably ask.
Yeah, no, I agree. I would say the distrust maybe has come in when it comes to the actual granting of the licenses, where folks, for some reason, they don't believe that their story or their experience really translated into them obtaining a license or being selected for it. But beyond that, yeah, I would say it's almost the opposite, where people are really encouraged once they realize what's in the bill and they see my past can't be held against me, and I can actually utilize the experience that I've had and apply it to the new industry. But yeah, I would say it's usually more encouraging than distrustful.
And just real quick, I think on a related note, that's kind of one of the benefits of diversifying the industry, is that it brings new ideas and perspectives. And there's kind of this shared, cultural context with minority, employees in their communities. These businesses are able to, open the doors to communities that might have otherwise, been skeptical to engage with the industry based on, the painful past.
Thank you so much. So we do have another question from Rick D'Onofrio. I heard legalizing marijuana may be put in front of the legislation in March. Does anyone know anything about this? Representative Edosinski?
Yeah, I guess that would be. We're meeting. My legislative aide and myself and the staff are meeting with the House Attorney tomorrow. We basically have all the changes kind of scribbled down on notepads and cuts and pastes from other state laws. So we're going to be starting the revision tomorrow, and it's going to probably take about a week for her to finalize. So we're hoping, March is what we're shooting for. We're shooting to hopefully get the bill out of committee, but before March is over. So we want to get moving on it.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all the work that you do to help get us a legalization bill out, and all the work that your staff does as well.
Well, thank you, Zoe, for putting on all these conferences and stuff like that to educate the public. And all I ask to say is anybody out there listening, please contact your state legislators and let them know how you feel about this legislation. I need some votes. So thank you.
Thank you again. So real quick, we're almost out of time, but while we have policy expert and attorney Devon Ward on, who's been working so hard in New Jersey, I was wondering, Devon, could you tell us about what's happening in New Jersey? I know there's been a lot of recent developments and whatnot. If you could please just give us a rundown of what's actually happening.
Yeah. So New Jersey on Monday finalized their legalization bills. The holdup there was, let me back up a little bit. In New Jersey, they in 2019, they approved a ballot initiative, which basically put the question of whether the residents in that state wanted to legalize. And then that ballot initiative was voted on in November of this year, and it overwhelmingly passed on a 2-to-1 margin. And so after that, the lawmakers had to come back and basically put the regulatory structure around what the market would look like. And so they passed 2 bills. One was more regulatory and the other one dealt with the criminal justice effects. And then the governor went to sign it and then realized that he didn't really like what the penalties would be for underage possession. And so they spent a couple months trying to hammer out that particular issue. But New Jersey, all in all, they passed a bill that decriminalizes possession up to 6 ounces. It dedicates 70% of the tax revenue to equity efforts. It dedicates 100% of the excise fee, essentially a fee that they're going to charge existing cultivators and dispensaries to be able to sell to adult clients or adult use residents. 100% of that fee is going towards equity efforts as well. And the bill has a host of discrimination and collateral consequence language. So they have a expungement process for all cannabis-related convictions. Sale, possession. It's no longer criminalized for you to be under the influence of marijuana, with the exception of obviously impaired driving. But it eliminates cannabis convictions or cannabis in your system from considerations for parole, probation, or pretrial release. So that's good. It eliminates prior convictions for considerations in custody. So it's a really strong proposal, and it's a really strong marker as we're moving through the year, because a lot of folks are looking at the entire East Coast is pretty much got legalization prospects. I know Liv is working on Maryland. Some of our other colleagues are working on Virginia. I'm working on Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. And so, the fact that New Jersey's bill went so far on equity, went really, really high with a really high legal possession limit, up to 6 ounces, to me sets a really high standard for the rest of the East Coast as they're all coming online this year. But I think the bill that made it out of New Jersey is a good start. And you can't get all this stuff right on the first go round. There are going to be tweaks. There's going to be changes as you learn more. But New Jersey's bill is very strong. The last thing I will say too, they dedicate up to in some instances 25% of the licenses in each category specifically to equity applicants. And so it's a pretty strong bill in terms of equity on the licensing side, and also on the revenue side, on the reinvestment side, and then the personal liberty pieces too. Again, they went really far on that. Legal possession up to 6 ounces is pretty significant. So I think it bodes well, and hopefully it influences how Delaware writes their legislation, because I know that Delaware and New Jersey are border states, so I'm hoping some of those considerations are taken into account when Delaware's crafting their bill.
Absolutely. I think Jersey's got a great bill. I love the micro business section of it. Again, that's another tool to keep big marijuana out, to give opportunities for Delawareans to start these micro businesses and then potentially move up to larger footprints. But Jersey, I've read through, and it's a long bill. I've read through it quite a few times, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff that we're kind of putting off. Like I said, we can't do everything at once, but there's stuff in Jersey's bill that I've definitely highlighted, and I'm holding off for future legislation once we get get the initial legislation passed. But thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're almost out of time. We just want to thank everyone who joined us for this important conversation tonight. A big thank you to our special guest speaker, Wilmington City Councilwoman Sinead Darby, and our amazing expert panelists, including Attorney Devon Ward, Olivia Naugle, and Kareem Kenyatta. We're so very grateful for all three of you joining us tonight and sharing your expertise and experience with our audience. We also thank our legislative guest speaker, Representative Ed Osinski. Thank you for taking the time to answer questions tonight, and for all the work that you do in helping us move forward to repeal cannabis prohibition. And we appreciate your leadership on this issue. We also thank Delaware State Auditor Kathy McGinnis for joining us tonight. Auditor McGinnis will be our very special guest speaker at our next legalization forum, Thursday, March 18th, which will focus on the financial cost of prohibition and economic benefits. So please join us Thursday, March 18th at 7 p.m. for that conversation. And thank you so much, Auditor McGinnis, for joining us tonight. Also, I want to thank MVP's Karen O'Keefe, who's been behind the scenes as our special guest streaming platform producer. We also have a number of events that we're organizing over the next few weeks and few months to pass adult use cannabis legalization. We have our volunteer info session tomorrow night, where we'll be unveiling our 2021 spring outreach strategy and plan. And as Representative Ed Osinski mentioned, we're just weeks away from cannabis legalization bill being reintroduced in the Delaware State Legislature. So we really want to encourage everyone to please contact your elected officials and ask them to prioritize cannabis legalization in 2021. We don't have voter referendum in Delaware like our neighbors in New Jersey. So engaging our elected officials is literally the only way to change the law here in Delaware. Thank you again for taking the time to join us tonight. I'd like to leave everyone with one final thought, a direct quote from a recent study from the University of California published by the National Institute of Health. We need to treat the cannabis policy started in 1937 the same way we treated segregated schools and other race-based policy. Our inquiry needs to start with the acknowledgement of the history of racial discrimination in our drug policy and move towards serious evidence-based research. If we fail to do so, we will remain the willing victims of our own racist history. Thank you again for joining us for this conversation tonight. Good night. Thank you.